emblazoned on the bottom of that. So wear this with pride and thank you for your contribution. And David Willig is also a Paul Harris Fellow. We think +7. David's not here today. But when you see him, thank him for his contributions to the Rotary Foundation. And you have the opportunity to do that every 6 months in your dues statement. It's suggested at least $50 for each one of those dues statements. And you have the option to increase it. And I would suggest and request that you do that. Put in at least $100 and you'll be a Paul Harris Fellow that much faster. Thank you.
Congratulations to all the Paul Harris Fellows today. Next, we're going to have a campaign statement, I guess that's the 3 or 4, regarding our challenge program, which will be here before you know it.
Okay, that's right. If I'm talking to you, the challenge is just around the corner. So this is quick trivia. If you're on the plane, you cannot answer. Does anyone know in how many days will we be hosting Challenge 2024? Close. In 19 days. So it's almost here. It's on January 27th. It's actually on the table in front of me, so I thought so. The next question. In what year did Lewis McReynolds and Catherine Lowe, two Rotarians, compete in Rotary Challenge?
1901.
1980, yes, 1980. They did for Vanguard, and Catherine, what school were you with? Wake up, Richfield, and Vanguard. And final question, how many years have we held the challenge competition? 52? 56. Our 56th year of last year. So it's been going on a long time. After 56 years, I hope everyone in here knows what the challenge competition is. If you don't, it's a service project from Rotary. Once a year, we host a competition with a local news station, and area high schools compete in general knowledge trivia. The trivia lasts about 20 minutes, so it's a lot. The teams are 4 students, and it is single elimination. So once you lose, you go home. Does anyone know what the prize is for the top team? It is usually $1,000. This year and last year we had a donation, so this year the top team is taking home $1,500. And they take that home to their school in cash to be used, I guess, for a month. So a couple of updates. It is happening in 19 days. We are looking at changing the venue. Baylor is very good with admissions. And so we are trying to work with NCC to secure it there, which is near my heart, so I'm excited about that. So I have an ask. On your table, there is a white slip of paper. On January 27th, we need help. We need a few more people who can show up for a couple of hours and just chit-chat. Talk to the schools, make them feel like they're at home. Those kids are nervous. The teachers don't always know where they're supposed to be going and when. But we can use a few more people. And so if you will mark on here, if you can show up on January 27th for a few hours and leave it on the table, I will pick it up and I'll get in touch with you and tell you what I need from you. Or if you want to help on the committee, there's also a checkbox for that. I'm not saying it's the most fun committee. I'm just saying that me and Dana and Ken and just very fun. So it might be the most fun thing. But we would love to have you on the committee if you want to be more involved. The other item on your table is for swag bags. And I don't know who put in all the hard work, but the last time I talked to you, we had 8 teams, and now we have 14 teams. So I need nearly 100 swag bags for these students who absolutely love and return every year for these bags full of, I don't know how they like them, but it's just a free bag of stuff, and just love that kind of thing. So if you are a business or anyone that wants to contribute to those swag bags, I take pens, pencils, notepads, cups, I don't care, whatever you have, I'll take it. If I have too much, I'll save it for next year, and if I don't have enough, I'll spread it out amongst all the bags. I'll take anything, and there's every single, some people brought stuff today. If you didn't bring stuff today, there's every possible way that you could contribute to the service project for Rotary. If you email me, you can text me, you can Venmo me if you want to send me some money. If you want to write a check to the youth services fund, write a check, and I know Joanne's so happy to take your money. Or you can stop by my office, and if you do stop by my office, I will look into my crystal ball, and I'll tell you if the stock market is going to move in 2020. Any questions? Good?
Thank you, Sabrina. We really hope that it works so hard for this event that you can contribute or volunteer in any way that you can. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our chair for today, Dr. Scott Livesay, who will bring our program.
Thank you, and I want to say I'm really pleased that we're in this location. I think it's been great for our club. I think attendance-wise, and I think it's really been super, and our attendance has gone up. It just seems to be a simple location. And I think our members are happy, and our program's been great starting out the year. I want to say that this program's a real special program. Some of you have heard Dr. Matthews already here in town. I think the Republican Women's Group, a few other things, but I did not know Dr. Matthews, and being a guy that kind of likes nicknames, I nickname everybody, and I like nicknames and enjoy nicknames, so my first thought was, why was he a Sparky? And so I asked him that question. The only Sparky I knew of in my lifetime, I guess, was Chevy Chase's character in the National Lampoon. I guess I related to Chevy Chase a little bit. And so I said, why are you a Sparky? I don't know why he was a Sparky either, but I guess in a simulated Air Force maneuver, he was actually electrocuted, but came back to life somehow miraculously and survived this electrocution. And his Air Force colleagues decided they would call him Sparky. They renamed him, and it stuck. So that's where that is. And he's a distinguished Air Force gentleman, spanning about 28 years of Air Force. For a young guy like he is, he's done a lot of things. And I want to be sure I mention these, so bear with me just a moment. He actually graduated from Baylor in 1992 with a degree in healthcare and biology in 92, and he came back to Waco, back to Baylor in 2020. He's a graduate of UT Health Science Center, got his MD from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and then he's also got his graduate degree at the National War College, and has boards in aerospace medicine and public health. I think importantly, Dr. Matthews was the first Surgeon General of the U.S. Space Force that President Trump started. He was also Command General and was responsible at the height of his career for almost 160,000 active duty folks, as well as retirees and their dependents. That's quite a large group, but he was responsible for all those lives and their safety. Now, Sparky and his wife, Monica, live back in Waco now, as we've said, and they have 2 adult daughters. One lives in Washington, D.C., and one in Dallas. He officially retired, effectively retired August 1st of 2020, and as we said, came back to Waco, and currently he's the pre-medical mentor and clinical professor there at the Baylor Honors College. And he's really our incoming president of the Lincoln County Medical Society. And we just had that party a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to tell you what happened. I didn't hear a word he said. He came in as the new president of the Lincoln County Medical Society, following up with Wayne Falcone. And I went back here at the table, and I'm going to blame a couple of Rotarians for me not hearing anything he said. One was from Presbyterian Don Lewis, one Presbyterian Dr. Eddie Morrison. And Ron Ritchie had something to do with it, and Bill Turney had something. I didn't hear a thing he said. So what I promised him today, I would listen, take notes, and be sure that I heard everything that was said today. But we're really fortunate to have the Matthews back in Waco. I've not met Monica, but I'm sure she's delightful, and we're just so glad to have them live in our community. When I opened my practice in December of '78, which me as a really, really old guy, I was always proud of this county medical society. Always proud of the doctors. If I had surgery, I stayed here. Most of my patients had surgery here. And this gentleman adds immensely to our medical society. The weight of his history, his background, his experience adds tremendously. So I'm really happy to have them here with us. Now his topic will be the future of American medicine in space. So let me welcome now Dr. Sparky Matthews.
Forgive me, I am not a stand behind the podium guy. So, all right, well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today to speak with you. I'm very honored to speak with this group. After that introduction, so I really appreciate that. Most people hear all those things and they say, wow, that guy is really bald. So, what I usually tell people is when you have a resume like that, it just means that you stuck around and were stucky with a lot of different things before you finish. But it's my pleasure to be here today. See lots of friends in the audience. Of note, Colonel Don Riley is here, and Don commissioned me into the Air Force 31 years ago. So Don, it's great to see you. So it really is a pleasure to be here to talk with you today about something that most people have not heard much about. So, but to begin, we can't talk about space medicine before we talk about space. So space is one of my favorite things to talk about. And by the way, if you walked in through all the rain to get in today, there's no rain in space. Okay? So that's one advantage. So space is really exciting, and it's been exciting for a long time, but it's become especially exciting in the last 5 to 10 years because we are on the verge of doing things that we could only dream of up until about 50 years ago. And that is, we are going to Mars. Now, how can I be so sure that that's the case? It's not because of NASA. It's not because of the U.S. government, because as someone who worked with the U.S. government for many years, I can tell you that you do not trust the speed of the government. Okay, they move at a glacial pace. But I know we're going to Mars because Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. And the best way to accomplish anything in this world is to tell Elon Musk he can't do it. Okay? And then that guarantees it's going to happen. And we were talking before we started today that SpaceX with Elon Musk and Blue Origins with Jeff Bezos are serving the same function for NASA that the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. Because NASA is struggling to keep up with SpaceX because they want to get there first, but we all know that's not going to happen. The first footprint on Mars is going to be Elon Musk's foot. He's going to be the first guy to step on Mars. But that's driven NASA to move faster to get to Mars. So when we talk about going to Mars, that's a 6 to 9 month distance, travel time to get there one way. So we've got to figure out what we're going to do once we get there, and we're going to have to practice that without having to go 6 to 9 months into space to do that. So that is the reason that we are going to go back to the moon first before we go on to Mars. So when we talk about going to space again, we're talking about going first to the moon and then to Mars. So NASA is working through some of those problems. SpaceX is working through some of those problems as well. So there's a lot of questions we have to answer, a lot of things that we have to be able to do in order to accomplish that. But here's the problem. When we look at going to Mars, we can't do it the way we did the Apollo missions when we went to the moon for the first time. During the Apollo missions, we went and we spent a couple of days walking around, got some moon rocks, rode the cool little buggy around, Then we get home. We're not going to go 6 to 9 months to Mars and spend a couple of days and come back. We're going to go and stay for a while to justify all the expense and all the effort to get there. So if we're going to do that, that involves answering some other questions. And one of the big things that we have to figure out is how are we going to medically support our astronauts that go to Mars for however long they're going to be there before they come back. Both going there, staying there, and then coming back. So that introduces a lot of questions that we have to answer. And that's the stage that we're in right now, is figuring out what questions to ask. So when I was at Space Force, we came up with 3 strategic lines of effort, 3 big questions that we had to solve before we could go to space for long duration. Because when we talk about the U.S. military, and that's what the Space Force is, NASA is an exploration organization. The Space Force is a military organization. And if we've learned one thing from human exploration throughout all of our history, is that you can only hold that which you can defend. And so when we go to Mars, and probably when we go to the moon, we will take defenders with us because we have peer competitors that want to take away everything we do everywhere that we go. And so we will have Space Force defenders that go with us either with SpaceX or with NASA. We never send military members into conflict. And here we're talking about conflict with the environment around us in space. We never send them into conflict without medical support. So we will come up with a way to practice medicine in space. So what does the practice of medicine in space mean? Well, for the last 70 years, space medicine has consisted of preparing astronauts to go to space, maybe giving them medication or asking them questions while they're in space, and then recovering them when they get back from space. We really haven't done much while they were away from the Earth. But if we're going to be gone with so many people for so long, we have to be able to figure out how to practice medicine in space. My biology professor here today, Dr. Dan Weeback, it's the only thing I remember in that biology course. He had this statement that he used to say, that an impossible event, given an infinite amount of time, becomes inevitable. And the more people that we have in space for the more amount of time, it makes a life-threatening injury or illness inevitable. That's going to happen. Now, we have had 3 life-threatening illnesses in the history of U.S. space operations that have been publicized. We've actually had more than that, but 3 that have been publicly acknowledged by NASA. The most recent one was when I was in Space Force. It was about 5 years ago. And we had an astronaut at the International Space Station that developed a ragged thrombus, a ragged clot, in her carotid artery. And it was a clot that had little fingers of clot that were floating out in the bloodstream, which is a high likelihood that one of those little pieces is going to break off, go to the brain, and cause a stroke. So we had to do something. We couldn't leave her there for another couple of months without doing anything. So we can either try to treat her there or bring her home. Now, if you bring her home, we have to bring the whole crew home because they go as a crew and they come back as a crew. And so this is the thing that you don't see on the television commercials for Eliquis. We sent a course of Eliquis, a blood thinner, up to the International Space Station. And over the course of several weeks, it remodeled that clot into a smooth clot, which allowed her to stay on orbit until the end of her mission. Now, why do I tell that story? That is a really simple problem to solve here on Earth. We know what to do about a clot in the carotid. You go take it out. Can't do that on the International Space Station. So what if somebody's going to be there instead for a couple of months, for 9 months, maybe for a year, maybe for 2 years? What do we do? Well, that's what we have to figure out. So there are 3 strategic lines of effort, 3 big questions that we came up with that we needed to solve. The first is, how do we send an ambulance to space? How do we send an ambulance to Earth orbit? Because if we have enough people there for enough time, somebody's going to get hurt or going to have a life-threatening illness. And the way that evacuation from space looks today is the same thing that aeromedical evacuation looked like in World War I. In World War I, if a soldier got injured on the battlefield, they put him on a litter, they loaded him into the canvas-covered tail of a JN-4 biplane and flew him away. No medical interaction, no medical care. They couldn't even touch him during the flight. They just wanted to get him out of there, because that's the most they could do. If somebody gets injured or ill on orbit today, we put their crew into the Dragon X space module, which is better than the Soyuz, which is where we were up until about 4 years ago. And we just drop them. We bring them back to Earth. We can't do anything with them until we get them back here. Not good enough. Not good enough. And that's a requirement that we have today. And anyone that's worked for the U.S. government will know that the government and the military in particular does not fund good ideas. They fund requirements. Okay, so until something becomes a requirement, we're not really going to solve it. But this is a requirement that we have today. So NASA has been working on this, and we have to figure out what vehicle we will use as the ambulance, and then what kind of crew that vehicle will have. The vehicle that we will use is called the X-38 lift vehicle. Who here remembers the $6 million man from the 70s, right? Okay, so here are the credits at the beginning. Colonel Steve Austin was flying his spacecraft and he crashes it. Well, the spacecraft he crashed was the X-38. So it's not an auspicious beginning for the X-38, but the X-38 was designed to be a lifeboat for the space shuttle and for the International Space Station. Now, we haven't used it that way because we haven't found a need for it, but that's what we will use. It holds a crew of 8. Or you can remove 4 of those seats and put a litter floor-loaded to hold a patient with 4 other crew members. So that's the lift vehicle that we will use. So how do we actually use it? What kind of crew do we put on that? Probably something like a critical care air transport team. I'm not going to go into the details of that at this time. But then we have to figure out where we're going to put it. So who here has heard of Muleshoe, Texas? Anybody here from Muleshoe? Okay. So I use Muleshoe with my students all the time until I had a student from Muleshoe. Okay, I got to use another name. Muleshoe, Texas. So Muleshoe has a hospital. Where does the ambulance and services that hospital stay in Muleshoe, Texas when it's not on the road? At the hospital, right? Small town, small population, that's where it stays. In Houston, you find ambulances posted up places other than at the hospital? Absolutely, they're all over town because we need a shorter response time to get to the patient. So when do we go from keeping that space ambulance on Earth to posting it up at the International Space Station? Here's the problem. The X-38 has a 6-month battery life. So every 6 months, you've got to bring it home and send another one up there. But how many people do we have to have on orbit, and what kind of operations do we need to be doing to justify those launches to put that X-38 on orbit? I don't have the answers to these questions. My generation is coming up with the questions. Those are the questions we have to ask. So that's a relatively easy problem to solve. Okay, it's one that we have a reminder for today. That gets us from Earth orbit back to Earth. So the next strategic line of effort, the next question is, how do we move patients between planetary orbits? Starting with the moon. So when the Mars Orion mission is launched to go to Mars, it will not launch from Earth. It's going to launch from the moon. It will launch from an orbiting space station, the lunar orbiter, that the Orion mission will launch. It will slingshot twice around the moon and then head to Mars, which means that we have to put this package together on orbit around the moon in an industrial environment. So somebody's going to be hurt. So let's say someone gets hurt in orbit around the moon. How do we get it back to Earth? How do we move patients from lunar orbit to Earth orbit? Because we figured out how to get them from Earth orbit to Earth. That's the first question. So actually, this is probably an easy question to answer as well. We will likely use the Orion habitation module to move them. Okay, so the Orion mission will be composed of a landing module that will actually go to the surface of Mars, a propulsion module, which is the rocket that's on the other end, and in between that is the habitation module. That's where our astronauts will live for the 6 to 9 month journey going from the moon to Mars. And the habitation module looks like a gigantic oil drum. It's not a complicated structure. It's just a canister that has a galley, has crew quarters, has workstations, has exercise facilities. And this would be a relatively easy place to transport a patient, no matter what their injury is. So we essentially put them on a backboard or put them in a sleeping bag and velcro them to the wall, because it's all with microgravity. Okay, so pretty easy to move them back and forth that way. Which brings us to the third strategic line of effort, and this is the big question. How do we do medical and surgical resuscitation on the surface of another planet? How do we do surgery in space? How do we do surgery on the moon? How do we do it on Mars? Now, when I first talk about surgery in space, most people get the image of surgery in a floating space station where we're floating around. You see the problems with this, right? Okay. You open the belly, they stay where they're supposed to stay. They float around. Okay, so doing surgical resuscitation in particular on orbit is not, that's a very difficult problem to solve. So you take that patient down to the surface of the planet that is orbiting around. So that means that starting with the moon, as practice for Mars, we will have to have a medical unit on the planetary surface. So what does that medical unit look like? Well, it's going to look a lot like the fuselage of an airplane. It's got to be a pressure vessel, because anyone that has practiced aerospace medicine or anesthesia will tell you that you have to have the concentration and pressure of oxygen the same as you have on Earth in order for tissues to heal, for the body to heal itself after surgery. So we have to have a pressure vessel that has the same pressure as sea level on Earth. Now, that sounds like not too hard a problem to solve, but here's the problem. The bigger the difference between the external pressure outside that vessel and the internal pressure, the bigger, chunkier, and more expensive it becomes to build that pressure vessel. But that's something that can be done. So we've got the vessel, but then we have to actually operate within it. So we have to have at least one operating room and one ICU bed to do surgical and medical resuscitation and surgical recovery. Now, everybody here has been inside an operating room, right? Pretty crowded, lots of stuff. All that stuff has got to get to Mars. How do you do that? Think about an ICU with all the monitors. All that stuff has got to get to Mars. Payload going from the surface of the Earth to space is at an enormous premium. So during the Apollo missions, one of the astronauts wanted to take some trinkets with him to the moon. Some personal items that he could then bring back and say, hey, baby, this has been to the moon. No, that's something you want to do for a young single guy, yeah? Okay, so he talked to the lead aerospace engineer and said, hey, I want to take some stuff with me. How much weight can I take with me? And the engineer said, well, here's how you start. Take whatever you want to take with you, go out to the front yard of the home and throw it up in the air. If it comes back down, it's too heavy. So that's the premium that the road has going to space. It costs a lot to get a relatively small amount of payload to space. So there's some things we're going to have to take with us. We've got to take an anesthesia machine. We'll have to take an OR table. But what about medical instrumentation, surgical instruments? What about bandages? What about supplies? What about medications? Is there another alternative that we could use without having to have supply missions that are going back and forth, taking those things to Mars? To the moon first and then to Mars. Well, there is. And that solution is likely going to be 3D printing. So imagine if you could 3D print surgical instruments in a sterile environment. There goes your autoclave. Don't need that anymore. Okay, you don't need to bring all that metal up to Mars and then take the stuff back. You print the instruments you need, you use them, and then you disintegrate them back into the slurry for the printer, and you print them again. So that can solve a lot of problems. We have already printed a gauze bandage that is impregnated with neomycin antibiotic in a single pass print. That's already been done, folks. We are so close. So close. What about printing medications? I mean, medication is nothing more than a molecular structure. What about a 3D molecular printer that prints 1 million copies of this molecular structure and then aggregates it into a pill or to an IV bag? Suddenly, you've printed your medication. Now, when I was the hospital commander at Craig Joint Theater Hospital in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, 2/3 of the floor space of my hospital was my pharmacy and my blood bank. My pharmacy is taken care of by that 3D printer. What about the blood bank? Would it surprise you to hear that red blood cells have already been printed on a 3D bioprinter at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences? They've already done this. They printed them as O-negative red blood cells without antigens, so they can't be rejected. Now, the FDA is currently evaluating them to see if they function as red blood cells, but this has already been done. We are so close. On the International Space Station, we have contractors that are trying to 3D print a human kidney with no antigens, so it can't be rejected. We're so close, so close. So imagine no blood bank, no pharmacy, all of that stuff that you printed. You print your red blood cells, put them on the shelf. When they expire, you disintegrate it, return to the slurry, print them again. Do the same thing with the medication. Print the penicillin as you need it. Wow, what an amazing thing. So that's where we're going with the practice of medicine in space, the surgical and medical resuscitation on other planets. Have we figured out all the questions to ask yet? No. Have we figured out the answers to those questions? No. I don't have answers for virtually any of these questions. Me and my colleagues have been and are trying to figure out the questions to ask. The answers to those questions will be developed by the students that I teach at Baylor today. So I usually give this talk to students, to undergrad and medical students. And I always end this talk by telling them that the first trauma surgeon, emergency physician, and critical care nurse to receive deployment orders to the moon is in undergrad or medical school today. And then I tell them, is it going to be? Because somebody's got it. Thank y'all very much for giving me some time to talk about it. I'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has questions. Yes, sir. Great question. So I have students asking me this, at least one person asking me this every time we do this talk. Why? Why are we doing all this? Why spend all this time and money to go to Mars, to take humans to Mars? Well, the philosophical answer to that is because we can. And humans have never been constrained from doing what they can do based on what they maybe should or should not do. So if we can go to Mars, we're going to go. Now, the utilitarian answer to that question is, remember I said that good ideas are not funded, only requirements are. So going to taking humans to Mars for long duration is going to develop requirements that we have to solve before we go there. So can you imagine, so printing red blood cells, 3D bioprinter or 3D printer to print surgical instruments that don't require autoclave, different things like that. Can you see the applications of those things on Earth as well? So let's say I could go to West Africa, and we have an outbreak of Ebola there, or an outbreak of any disease there. And I can print red blood cells, I can print medications there. I don't have that logistics trains to bring that stuff in back and forth. Huge applications. Anything that we do in space will have applications on Earth as well. So So that's not the reason that we go, but that is the byproduct of going to Mars. So the good news is, though, is when you say, why do we go? That was more of an applicable question for going to the moon with NASA back in the 60s and 70s, because that was, we were paying for that. All of us were paying for that. But with our commercial organizations like SpaceX and Blue Origin, that question is less applicable now, because they're going because they want to go and they're funding going to, they're getting some government money, but they're mostly self-funded to do that. But there are huge advantages to going to Mars that can be applied all over the world. It can revolutionize medicine. And that's just the medical applications. It can revolutionize a lot of other things as well. Is that a reasonable answer? Yes, sir.
So with the saber rattling from China and Russia in our partnership we had in here, the Space Force fundamentally developed to ensure like A-79 had stability in case relations broke off?
So that's a great question. So the mission of the Space Force when we stood up was to protect in and from threats in space. To defend in space and things from space as well. So the Space Force actually, it developed out of something that we'd already been doing for decades already. So we had the Air Force Space Command, which basically had the same role that Space Force has now, a little bit less. And we also have the U.S. Space Command, which is our warfighting command in space. I can't talk a lot about the threats that we have in space, but let me just leave it with, there are significant adversary and near-peer competitors in space that can threaten things that we have there and things that we have on Earth as well. And so the Space Force was developed to give, with a recognition that we simply had to allocate more effort and more money towards defending from space, because that's really where that was an uncovered threat, a location. That was an uncovered warfighting domain up until the first commanding general of the chief of space operations for the Space Force, General J. Rankin, was my boss. With our first staff meeting after the Space Force stood up, we're all sitting around this big staff table, all the directors. And he went through and he had every single one of us talk about what we were dreaming and planning for and what our goal was as we saw it in the Space Force. And when it got to me, I talked about those three strategic lines of effort, the practice of medicine in space. And when the S3, the operations guy, who was an astronaut, by the way, when I got to him, he said, "Boss, I'm not quite sure where you're going with this. I mean, what are you expecting us to defend from? Like aliens?" Just kind of joking around. And General Raymond looked at me and said, "If not us." I mean, we don't know what's out there. We talk about that, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, they handle 100 miles up, down to the surface of the Earth, and all of that. That's their warfighting domain. Space Force has 100 miles up to the end of the universe. That's our warfighting. That's where the threats are that we deal with. And so, a little daunting, but exciting as well. Really exciting. That's right. It's funny. Aerospace engineers, they just don't get the whole medicine thing, because the medical kit for the Orion mission to Mars, as they designed it, was the size of a shoebox. Like, no, you got to do better. We can't do it this way. But the thing is especially medicine in the military, whether it's aerospace or space medicine, if we don't think about it, nobody else does. So we have to come up with those solutions. Other questions?
I think we're about out of time.
Okay.
I believe Dr. Matthews said you could hang for a few
Sure.
minutes.
Well, I can tell you this was, you had everybody mesmerized, as I thought you would, and hopefully we can have him back in a few months with some updates on what else you can do with a 3D camera. My mind is just crazy with that, but That's, yeah. I want to re-welcome our guests today. Be aware that we do have applications if you enjoyed today. If you'd like to join Waco Rotary Club. I want to thank all my fellow Rotarians that made the program possible today. And with that, we'll stand and recite the four-way test. Our dinner is done. Is it the truth? Rotary is adjourned.